In this video, I will explain another side of globalization. So we all know how globalization has many advantages that cover different areas. For example, it provides an increase in cultural exchanges and it also creates jobs. But the question many of us might have is, does globalization really benefit everyone in the world? Because when we talk about globalization, many of us see it as economic globalization that is centered around increasing economies in different countries. But there has also been another growing view of what globalization actually is and the consequences of globalization. So nowadays there has been a lot of globalization has been criticized for preventing local development in poor countries. And a question that has arisen because of these criticizement is globalization really just a new phenomenon, or is it just another word for colonialism? So before I dive deeper into the link between globalization and colonialism, I need to explain what colonialism actually means. So colonialism is when another country invades another country and exploits their natural resources for production. A similar phenomenon you might have heard of is neocolonialism, and neocolonialism has been linked with globalization for years, and it is when developed countries control the actions of developing countries. These developed countries, they own parts of the economy of those weaker countries, and these countries need to hand over their natural resources at low rates, and they need to comply with foreign policy. So that's what neocolonialism is. And an example of this is Indonesia. Indonesia was a Dutch colony in the past and remained until World War II. But after World War II, Indonesia fought for their independence, but the Dutch did not want that. So they fought with each other and a ceasefire happened, which Indonesia wasn't really happy with, but they agreed. And this is the interesting part. What happened was Indonesia had their control over political things, so they were allowed to have their political independence, but Indonesia's economy was in control of the Dutch. So Dutch had control over international trade and finance and banking of Indonesia. So if you compare this with globalization nowadays, with how companies deal with it, I'm gonna explain how companies do this. So what companies do is, if they look for cheap labor in these countries and raw materials to expand their operations in those weaker countries. So they use their financial power to force those small companies out, to force those local companies out, because then they have no competition at all, and they do this through mergers or acquisition. So many Western countries also choose to move their production to poor countries because they don't have really strict laws regarding taxation, environmental legislation, and also workers' laws are not very strict, so companies just ignore them. And another interesting part about this is, how do financial institutions actually deal with this? So if you also look at organizations like the International World Trade Organization and the World Bank, what they do to developing countries is, if any of these countries want to borrow money, they have to incorporate a free trade market system to access these loans. And we all know that these financial institutions are the Western countries control them. So this means Western countries, they impose certain conditions, and those developing countries need to meet these conditions before they access loans. So they need to meet those trade policies. So there are conditions to be met before accessing those loans. So what we have seen is globalization has mainly benefited foreign investors, but have not benefited the people in developing countries. Yeah. So you might ask, what are the negative consequences these developing countries may face? So a few of them are, these developing countries need to reduce their companies' taxes in order for multinational companies to come into their country. They've also faced a degradation of environment. They've also faced rising income inequalities, and developed countries also leave out local companies. So it's all about those multinational organizations. And because of the protectionist policies imposed by developed countries, developing countries have difficulty accessing the markets of those developed countries. So these are the negative consequences. So personally, I feel like Western countries, we see that Western countries are pushing more for trade, more openness, and more markets, because they're the only ones that benefit from it more than other countries. So you might also ask, but this is not a reason why the economy has been, why the economy doesn't grow in developing countries. True, maybe because also of poor leadership. But if we do not open our markets to these countries, their economy will stay the same, or just it will be worse, or they will be more in debt and in poverty. So if you look at the strategy these multinational organizations use, we might look at Porter's view on strategy. Because if you look at competition in international trade regarding developed countries and developing countries, we can see how it is actually really unfair towards developing countries, because they face a lot of trade restrictions which rich countries do not face. So if you link this with Porter's view on strategy, well, let me first explain Porter's view on strategy. Okay, so this is Porter's view on strategy. So in Porter's view, a company is successful when it has a dominant competitive position by choosing one of these three categories. So differentiation, cost leadership, and cost focus. So I will explain what all of them include. So if you look at differentiation, this is a type of strategy which a company seeks to distinguish its products or services from other competitors. So an example of companies that incorporate differentiation is Apple. Another example is Lego. Then we look at cost leadership. Cost leadership for companies means to be the low-cost producer of the industry. So an example of this is of a company is Amazon. Then we look at cost focus. Cost focus is a type of strategy that emphasizes concentration on a specific market, so a niche market. And an example of a company is Rolls-Royce. So this is Porter's view on strategy. So Porter's view is about having no competition at all and gaining a monopoly. So we've seen how developed countries may have incorporated these ideas because of how they leave out local companies, and they just don't want any competition at all. So what neocolonialism and globalization both have in common is that they benefit only the developed countries, and they make those developing countries grow more in poverty and in debt. So a few of these criticisms has been maybe globalization has even achieved what colonialism had done, but through a political, correct and legitimate manner. So now you might ask, okay, so do you have any solutions, or how do we solve this? So for me personally, I think that in order to reduce, or in order to prevent an increase in poverty in developing countries, I feel like developed countries need to open up the markets and make their trade restrictions softer. Because now if a local company wants to compete or wants to sell its products in developed countries, he faces prices that are too high for him because of the import barriers, and so they just want to sell the products for a decent price. I feel like then the economy will grow more, and in all countries I feel like we need to raise awareness, critical awareness about these terms as global injustice and privileges and all these kind of stuff. So just thinking about challenging injustice and just thinking critically about it, I think this will lead us more into a sustainable world. Yeah, so this is my view.